This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the aquatic ape hypothesis and its updated version in the 21st century from its 1970s heyday. I have two people who are familiar with it and will speak on it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is the updated aquatic ape hypothesis, or the waterside theory. It posits that human beings had a semi-aquatic or aquatic state within their evolutionary development. It first hit its heyday almost 50 years ago with Elaine Morgan's book about the hypothesis, and Erica Chagatai and Tom Brenner are here to talk about the 21st century and what things have transpired in the decades since. So Erica, who is on the top of your screen, if you could give me a little bit of background information about yourself, what you have written about, and what draws you to the aquatic ape hypothesis.
I'm a professor at Mid-Sweden University, and I study the human diving capacity. And the reason why I find the aquatic ape hypothesis appealing is that it would explain why humans are so good at freediving. And I have studied human freedivers in all kinds of shapes and varieties that you can find. People that dive for food in Asia, like the Ama divers, and also the Baja water people in Indonesia, and also done a lot of studies on competitive freedivers to see what it is in their bodies that make them survive when they go 200 meters on one breath.
I just want to ask, regarding other apes, have we ever studied their lung capacity? Do humans have, for example, a greater lung capacity than a similar sized gorilla?
No, I haven't studied apes. It's very little done on anything related to diving apes because they are known to not be very strong on water. I can hear a lot of flushing now. Should I speak on? Or?
Speak over. Just so people know, Tom Brenner is in an airport, and so occasionally you're going to hear the sounds. I guess it's about one of those revolving doors.
That's an opening and closing door, and my finger is over the. It's an opening and closing door, and my finger is over the microphone, and that obviously is not doing the whole job.
Well, don't worry about it. We know about it, and I appreciate you coming. To get back to Erica and just finish up her introduction. Erica, you said that you were drawn to the aquatic ape hypothesis because of the diving. Go ahead.
I can explain because I was very interested in trying to understand how people freedive because I met on my travels in Asia a population called the water people, and they were excellent freedivers. And when I returned to my biology studies after this trip, I tried to read in the medical literature about human freediving, and it basically said that you will die if you do what I could see these people could do. And I got very interested, and I thought we don't know enough about this. So I started a PhD on the human diving response. And in the 80s, it was thought that we have a rudimentary diving response, but it doesn't conserve oxygen, it doesn't help us very much underwater. Mm-hmm. So, but we actually, it's funny.
Okay.
So when they stop flushing, I will continue. Oh. So we did some studies on the oxygen conserving capacity of the human diving response, and we actually found that it is quite useful when we dive. And from that on, I studied human diving and other extreme situations with hypoxia. And when I first heard of the aquatic ape hypothesis, I thought, wow, this is something that when I first heard of this theory, I thought this is something that can help us explain why people are completely terrestrial animals actually have some capacity to be underwater. But to me, as a biologist, it was quite a logical explanation for what I had seen already.
Okay, let me just go to Tom then. Tom, if you could give a little background about yourself, who you are, and what has drawn you to the aquatic ape hypothesis.
So I'm a professor of pediatrics, nutrition, and chemistry at the University of Texas at Austin in the Dell Medical School, and I've been here for 2.5 years after 28 years in the nutrition department at Cornell University. I got interested in this story as a result of my interest in particularly omega-3 fatty acids, but nutrition in general. A number of my close colleagues have been interested in the waterside ape hypothesis, or the aquatic ape hypothesis. Michael Crawford and Stephen Cunnane have written about this extensively and have been around this area for probably 30 years. The question of how the human brain capacity increased dramatically in, let's say, starting about 2 million years ago to about 200,000 years ago is really an open question. And how that would have happened with the food supply that's on the savannas, more than just protein and calories, which is what is focused upon in the usual evolutionary discussions of nutrition, but the more minor components that supply brain components, specifically omega-3 fatty acids, minerals, and so forth, those nutrients are much richer at the seashore than they are on the savannas of Africa. And that leads us to think much more about limiting nutrient supply. That is, what is the limiting factor for expansion of brain capacity and expansion of neural tissue specifically.
So specific, what we'd be looking at then is that there wouldn't, for example, fish oil and seafood is considered high in what you were describing as the omega-3 stuff, and that I know is supposedly helpful for brain activity. So you're concomitant with that, I guess the what we could pull from that is that human beings' brain capacity got an evolutionary shot in the arm, so to speak, because supposedly of a seafood diet.
Yeah, and it's more than just helpful for the brain. The brain is brain structural material is actually omega-3 fatty acids. It's a little like as calcium is to the bones, omega-3 is to the brain, and so we need a supply of omega-3 fatty acids somehow. We also need a supply of minerals that are rich at the seashore, but not so rich in many inland areas. And we need a steady supply of energy to expend an enormous amount of energy it takes to grow a brain perinatally. And what we mean by that is before birth and after birth. And all those things lead us to look beyond the savannas to a more rich source of nutrients, besides, again, just energy and protein.
I want to just get into the historical aspect of what might have happened a million or so years ago, whenever this would have happened, and Africa's terrain then. But before I do, I just want to sort of step back pop culturally. In the 1970s, and I mentioned Elaine Morgan's book, she didn't actually propose the hypothesis, but she popularized it so that it, was on Phil Donahue and shows of that era here in the United States. What can either of you, for example, give me 2 or 3 specific things that now in the year 2019, as we record this, have changed specifically? You mentioned the omega-3 fatty acids, because as I recall as a boy back then, it was kind of sort of snickered at as a kind of, little more than sort of like Eric von Däniken and the UFO ancient astronaut stuff. It was kind of brushed off. So I don't know, Tom or Erica, either one of you, if you want to take that. What 2 or 3 things have changed now in the 40 plus years that have made it a more interesting and scientifically valid idea?
You can start if you want.
Well, I think a greater recognition of the importance of micronutrients, or not really micronutrients by the standards of the requirements, but a greater recognition of expanded nutrition beyond protein and calories is something that we think is important. and a little bit clearer idea about the other things around the difference in these various habitats. Our contribution, and we've made just some small recent contributions. When I say we, I mean my laboratory and collaborators have discovered some aspects of the really not the nutrition, but the development of fetal humans and fetal marine mammals that are parallel and are only seen in animals that have a high level of, let's say, of a watery environment or wet environments. And that also suggests to us that there's something in common that's really unexplained by any other hypothesis at this point.
Erica?
Yeah, I think we just simply know more about the human diving capacity. Also, free diving as a competition sport has developed since starting in the late 90s and up to now, and where the world record is 130 meters depth on one breath. And in the 60s, it was unheard of that people could dive that deep, and people are still going deeper and deeper. And we simply know more about how the human body copes with that. And we have found several reflexes that we share with marine mammals that we didn't know of before. I think Elaine Morgan and Hardy, they proposed the theory because we have no fur and we have subcutaneous fat and we can swim and dive a little bit. But there are so many other aspects to this theory that have come about. For instance, I thought a major argument against the theory was that we cannot see well underwater. But I could see that these water people, when they were diving without any equipment, they could still find little things that they were picking. And I got interest from a vision group in Lund, and a young PhD student, she came to me and she took this ball from my hands and tried to find out how they see underwater. And they showed in a nice series of studies that people can learn how to see quite well underwater. Mm-hmm. So there are some arguments against the theory that were simply researched, and they were found to be rather in support of the theory, actually.
Well, let's talk about some of the features that you'd mentioned. Anyone looking at a modern human, regardless of ethnicity, race, or whatnot, can see that unlike apes seem to have just nostrils that protrude like holes in the front of their face, whereas we have these sort of nice sloping noses that if we were swimming forward, prevents water from going in because the water would be going past. Maybe Tom, I'll ask you, has anyone done any studies, for example, on the development of why human beings have these, schnozzes, whereas apes just have the holes?
To my knowledge, no. I suspect that Eric could be more of an expert on that than me, but that very concept has occurred to me, and I have, at least in a casual way, looked for any sorts of explanations of why this might be the case. If you look at the face of a gorilla, for instance, they just simply don't have this nose. They have two holes, and then the rain just drips into the nostrils, and it's hard to imagine how they would swim very long distances. Yeah. But I don't know. Erica, you may.
Go ahead.
I don't think the problem when you dive is that water is pouring into your face. I think you can close very efficiently by using the back of your tongue.
Erica? Oh, she froze up there. Erica?
I cannot.
Okay. Go. You
something said it was broken. So
yeah. You froze up there for about 15 seconds or so, but continue.
Right. Should I do it again?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't think the major problem when you dive is that water is pouring into your face, because you can close the back of your nostrils by using the back of your tongue, because you have a lock on the back of your nose instead of the front of your nose.
Okay.
And also, I think the human capacity to move a lot of things in your thorax is quite unique. It's also been considered very important for speech. But when you dive, you actually have a major problem with equalizing your ears. and you have to have a very fine control of your throat, so to speak, to be able to do that. And I think that coincides to be the same kind of control that you need from speaking.
Well, let's talk about bipedalism too, because one of the things that, with the quote, I guess you call it the savannah theory, was that as our ancestors came down from the trees, in order to look out for cheetahs and tigers and lions and whatever else might be out there, hyenas that might want to eat us, we'd have to be able to stand tall and look over the 3-foot high grasses. With the waterside or aquatic ape idea, I would assume that standing up is to shallowly walk in water. But I would think too that evolutionarily there might be an advantage, since initially as your species is evolving to stand and be bipedal, it's easier to stand in water because it's versus Okay, hold on. Yeah, go ahead.
I've seen videos of orangutans and other primates walking knee waist deep in water, and it seems to be quite a simple thing, a lot more simple than on land. And so it's really hard not to think that might not have been a way of moving towards bipedalism. You also see them carrying their babies above the waist through the water, and it's really quite a compelling thing. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those videos are on YouTube.
But I don't see how any creature could benefit very much from wading alone. I mean, wading is kind of a combination with swimming and diving, because if you're going to have some use of the water, you need to get something from it. And unless you put your head down, otherwise you would need very long arms if you're a wading ape. So I think that argument is kind of double-edged, because I don't see why you would wade to use the food resources in the water, because then you can pick them when it's really very shallow water. But wading, of course, if you have caught a lot of things and you're carrying them, and you want to sit on the shore and eat what you have caught, then wading could be a kind of a thing to combine with diving. But I don't see how you could be for like a long stretch of generations a wading ape. But I agree with you that it would be easier to stand up. But of course, when I see the water people, how the women of the Bajau, they collect shells and then they swim to a little bit shallow place just to stand up for a little bit to rest, because it's more straining to swim than to stand, actually. So it's kind of, I only see it beneficial in combination with actually swimming.
Eric,
unless you just needed to cross a river when you really don't know how to swim.
Eric, I was just in Jeju Island in the south of Korea, and there are women on that island who famously swim for picking shellfish and so forth.
Similar to the Ama, yeah.
And so, same story. You're familiar with that group.
Yeah, I haven't been to the Jeju yet. I have been many times to Japan to see the Ama, but the Ama also originated in the Jeju Islands more than 2,000 years ago. So it's the same kind of culture that has spread over the region.
Erica and Tom, let me talk about a few more features and some of the more well-known features that have been incorporated into the hypothesis, and then you can maybe add one or two that I may not be familiar with. I think Tom mentioned subcutaneous fat, and this is one of the things that's interesting. Is I'm a people watcher, and one of the things from watching the early Planet of the Apes movies with Charlton Heston back in the 60s and 70s, even up to just sitting in a doctor's office and watching people, is I don't see how anyone could not think evolution is a thing, because we have so many ape-like traits, or they have so many traits that are in common with us. Yet it seems to me that the one thing that is different is you don't really see a lot of fat chimps or bonobos. You don't see a lot of fat gorillas, other than the water side hypothesis, what is the major counter hypothesis for why we would have fat if not for being in the water? Tom?
Well, if you want to see fat primates, you go to a zoo where they're fed and they get plenty fat.
Yeah.
So that's just one comment on that part of it. I do not know of explanations of the alternatives for subcutaneous fat. I know of no explanations for that. That doesn't mean there aren't any.
Yeah.
That just means off the top of my head, I don't know.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think also subcutaneous fat can be used as an isolation in cold conditions, but for sure it's much heavier than fur. So you would prefer to have a fur, but unless if you're already naked, you would put on subcutaneous fat maybe. So it is useful because you can close down the capillary circulation in your fat.
Yeah. Well,
but fur would be so much more efficient.
Yeah, that
it's kind of a waste of energy unless you just have it for energy supply, of course.
That leads to the next obvious one is our general hairlessness as a species. Yes, and there are some ethnic groups that famously have a lot of hair on their body, but generally speaking, human beings are hairless. And I've never really found that was even going back to my childhood and the 70s version of the hypothesis. That seemed to me to be one of the better ideas of it, because why would, if we're in the savannah, especially if, I mean, why would we lose the hair and expose our skin to all kinds of melanomas, perhaps? Yeah. So, Tom, if you want to talk about the hairlessness and how that plays into the theory, the hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so if one goes with the insulation hypothesis, then the question is, would you start out with fur? Why would we go to subcutaneous fats? That's a real question mark. In Africa, there would have been darker skin, and so the vulnerability to UV is not as much. But the general idea is that when mammals go into the water, their hair either recedes or becomes flat, and they become more or less hairless. But I'm not sure we really understand hairlessness as much as we would like to understand it. I don't know that we understand exactly why pigs are, or some pigs, not all pigs, have small amounts of hair.
It's domestic pigs mostly, because the wild boars, they have much more hair, of course. Yeah, but I think also if we would imagine a beach ape or a littoral ape, I think we would stay in the water and slowly we would get a little bit cold anyway. And if we then go up to the shore to rest and to get warm again, it's also not a good idea to have a lot of hair, because it would take a lot longer to dry and it would cool you. It would not allow you to warm up. And I see just this beach ape as a kind of a successful thing. It's a successful strategy to go between the cold water, even if it's 30 degrees in the tropical waters. It would be cold to the human body. It's not thermoneutral. But we can see even in the Philippine bajau that they can stay in the water for 2 hours, but then they are coming up because they're a bit cold, and they heat up very quickly in the warm sun, and because they are completely hairless, it's really, really quick, and they can go diving again and working again. So I think the fur would also be a hindrance if you want to go in and out of the water in a tropical environment.
Let me talk about another feature that is not given as much play, and maybe, Tom, you might want to take this first. I've read that human beings' fingers, when they're in the water, they prune up, so supposedly to give a better sense of feel underwater. And that is it true that human beings are the only creatures that we know of that go in the water that happens to?
I'm not really that familiar with,
No.
in order to be able to answer that. Erica might have a better idea about that.
Erica?
I have absolutely no idea, and I think it's an interesting aspect, and I don't think it would be terribly unique if it's a benefit underwater. And we don't have a problem gripping things underwater anyway, even when we just dive in. I don't see it as a major argument, even though it's very interesting. I think there are many other aspects that are much more interesting about humans being in water, like the oxygen conserving diving response, the blood boosting by the spleen that we share also with the seals, the capacity of using the lungs to a larger extent than we normally do just by a little training, and a great number of physiological responses that really are necessary to be able to work underwater for the major part of the day, like the Bajau and the Ama do. They can work underwater for half of their working time in a day, from hours at an end.
Yeah.
I was following a lady that was a professional AMA, and I could follow her. She was 79 years old also, which is a kind of elderly AMA, but she was not one of the oldest ones. But I could keep up with her for 10 minutes, and she was going 40 minutes under, 40 minutes at the surface, 40 minutes under, and so on. And then I had to rest to get rid of lactates and hypoxia byproducts, and I couldn't follow her anymore. And she did this for 4 hours straight. And you need to have a lot of things in place to be able to do that. And that is very strange if you're completely a land product. I would say I could not easily understand how a land mammal could do that. So that's why I think it's quite logical to me that at some point people were getting their food out of the sea.
Let me ask about something. I know in the 20th century version of the hypothesis in the 70s was often ridiculed or debunked, and that was the idea that somehow human beings vis-a-vis other apes have a bit more what they called webbing between the fingers. Is that true or not? And if so, would that be a remnant perhaps of this aquatic or semi-aquatic phase of human development? Either one?
I don't think it would be necessary because people swim very well without it. It could, but I have no idea if it's also existing in apes, and I for sure know that people don't need to have webbing to be able to swim.
Let me ask then about any other salient features evolutionarily that would give support to the waterside hypothesis. Tom, I've mentioned about 5 or 6 of them. Can you mention another couple that are generally not as well known or as, you know?
Well, in one of the contributions that we made recently, and I'll just say a few words about that now, the human substance known as vernix caseosa, which is this white waxy coating that human newborns are basically covered head to toe with, at least most human newborns at birth, was thought to be a uniquely human substance. No other terrestrial animal has it. And we showed a couple of years ago that California sea lions are also born with it and have some of the signature lipids in this material. It's a very high lipid material. It also has an unusual characteristic. It's created on the skin, but during the last part of gestation, this material sloughs off into the amniotic fluid as particles and is swallowed by the human. And now we know it's also swallowed by the California sea lion. And that parallel evolution, one can only speculate as to what the function of that is. But one of those speculations is that an animal that is born at the seashore might be vulnerable to getting a slug of water into their mouth before they can nurse, and this may be a hedge in creating a healthy microbiota. And of course, these days we recognize the microbiota as an important factor in health. So that's another aspect of it which has not really been addressed very well. We've only published that a couple of years ago, but there are important important aspects of the composition of that material, which is also in common with aquatic animals.
But why wouldn't the terrestrial baby have a bacteria in their mouth, through their mouth? Would it be more dirty to be in the seawater? I don't know.
Well, the idea would be if we had a common ancestry in which we were giving birth nearby the water, on the edge of the water. I was just in South Africa a couple of years ago, where human remains from 200,000 years ago at the seashore, and the idea is that a birth onto a beach, for instance, where there might be water, rather than and human babies are born, they don't stand. So a savanna animal is born, it stands, and the first thing it does is nurse. And a human baby is basically helpless. This is all speculation.
Yeah, I think to me it sounds a little bit far-fetched that we would be more protected, need more protection if we were in a seashore environment than if we were in the savannah, because we would need a kind of antibacterial in both places. But
well, it's not antibacterial. It enhances the development of healthy bacteria as opposed to unhealthy bacteria.
Yeah, but why would we need that better in the seashore?
The speculation is that an animal that is born on the ground is more likely to get a slug of water in its mouth before it's able to nurse, as opposed to an animal that is born and immediately stands up. That's the speculation.
But ape babies don't directly stand up, no?
Excuse me?
Maybe I shouldn't, I don't follow really why ape, the difference between human and ape would be in any way explain the human babies' characteristics, because ape babies, they don't stand when they are born.
Well, they're also born into a dry environment, so
full of bacteria.
Not really, no, not really, not the way it is. Not as much as one would expect if there is a watery environment. But again, this is speculation, so
I think so.
It's gonna.
I think there are many better arguments, but I also think one quite good argument for the aquatic hypothesis would be to give birth in water. I had my third child underwater because I also know that the Badger water people give birth underwater, and they told me it's better both for the mother and the child. And I also did baby swimming with my 3 children, and baby swimming works. And people, children that are born in the water, they don't inhale water. They hold the breath until they come to the surface, and they breathe like other children. And also the child can hold the breath automatically when you bring it underwater. There was no like aspiration of water.
I was
quite amazed that this works so well. I was a little bit nervous with my first child, and I didn't let him swim on his own. And with the second child, we started a little bit late, so he was already 6 months. But with the third child, I started when she was 4 days old, and she was big.
So, Erica, you said you gave birth while you were in water?
Yeah. With my third baby.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask, you jumped the gun on you anticipate where I was going to go next. Human babies, and this has been, I guess, for 50 or more years, when women have given birth in pools or in water, the babies seem very at home. And I mean, yes, they're in amniotic fluid, but aren't all mammals in amniotic fluid? And as you stated, Tom, a baby giraffe or a baby rhino or a baby elephant stands up, and so do you think that the natural, and it could only be natural if it's a newborn, the natural instinctive familiarity with a watery environment for human babies might be something that's a legacy of that aquatic or semi-aquatic phase?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to, again, what I've labeled speculation, I don't see that water births, which, again, you can see on YouTube, and everything I know about it is consistent with what Erica has personally experienced. I think that watery environment is not inconsistent with some of this other speculation.
Well,
and I think it would help people to have babies with big brains, because it's so much easier to give birth underwater when your own body is supported by the water. So I think I was very surprised that I could give birth without any real pain, because I thought there would be no baby because I didn't suffer. And suddenly I had my child. So it was, to me, kind of very aha, that probably the cost of having big brain babies could be kind of counteracted by giving birth in the water. It could even be a major cost of going into the water.
let me ask something and pick up on that big brain idea, or at least a big cranium, because I know, for example, that a lot of whales have much larger heads relative to the size of the body than, say, most terrestrial mammals. I mean, yes, an elephant has a big head, but and I think this is true with not only the whales, but also with walruses, pinnipeds, and even are manatees considered pinnipeds? I'm not sure, but they all seem to have larger heads, and I'm wondering if the aquatic ape hypothesis is correct, and did human brains or the human cranium perhaps increase in size, and that is what helped us get smarter than our more terrestrial cousins?
Of course.
I'm just asking as a layman.
Would be smarter. Where was I going to go with that? If Michael Crawford was here, he would probably refer to the not only a driving force in a way towards of evolution, but also the conditions of existence, and that means in this context. Nutrients that are required to expand that brain. So a brain, neural tissue, has a very different composition than the other organs in the body, particularly because of its fat, not just content but quality. And again, it goes back to the nutritional arguments that if we were near the seashore and we'd have these other, of course, it's always also the other issues. I mean, I very much think that the water birth experience, which is just astonishing the first time you see it. I haven't experienced it, obviously, but I've seen it as well, and Eric has experienced it, and that's just extraordinary if you know how babies are born in hospitals, to see how easy it goes in the water. But that combined with the nutrients could very well have helped to drive the big brain.
Well, go ahead, Erica. You want to say something?
At least, I mean, the driving force for a bigger brain is intelligence, obviously, but you have to afford to have a big brain. And by eating seafood, you afford to have this big brain that you need to be smart. It's not like you got a big brain and then you figured out what to do with it. It's like you always need to be smarter, especially if you change environments. And the human lineage, we have been experts on taking opportunities in different environments. I don't think we are just specialized on being on the seashore. I think seashore is one of the major environments that have shaped us, but certainly there are others. And because we were clever, we could take the benefit of all these environments, and that's why we are so plastic and flexible today. Human physiology is amazing because we are not experts on anything. We are generalists. We are very good at many different things, and one of these things is being in water and underwater. And I worry a little bit, Dan, when you say aquatic or semi-aquatic. I don't know anyone in this group of scientists that are interested in the aquatic or waterside hypothesis that say our ancestors were ever aquatic. Okay. Not Hardy and not Morgan and not anyone I know, but a lot of the they focus on that, and I don't think this was ever central to the theory. And personally, I don't think people were that much more aquatic than we are today, because we have this in our range of behaviors that we can live like water people or like the ama.
Let me ask something, and I want to sort of wrap things up in the next 5 or 10 minutes. The idea of balance, human beings, as bipedal animals, we have we're not as fast as other animals, but bipedalism is one of the great achievements physiologically speaking, and human beings have a great sense of balance with the inner ear. Does the sense of balance play any role in this hypothesis? Is balance needed as much underwater as on the land?
I think you have to have a strong sense of balance when you're moving in a three-dimensional world like in water. And also, a lot of marine mammals show that they have a very good sense of direction and balance, like sea lions in the circus. I know already Elaine Morgan, she showed some comparisons between the apes and the sea lions in a circus. But it is quite striking that marine mammals, like also dolphins, they can balance things and they can do all kinds of positions, because you are becoming very sensitive to that when you live actually in a three-dimensional world. If you're a quadrupedal animal, you're like a table. You can just hold on to the earth and you don't have to balance very much. But of course, there are other examples of animals that have a good sense of balance that live in the trees.
Yeah. Tom, do you have a comment on the balance?
Not really. It was well said by Eric. Sounds right to me.
Well, let me just end with a question, and then I'll give you both summing up. I mentioned that in the 1970s, when Elaine Morgan's book made the hypothesis well known for the first time, it was sort of derided and dismissed as sort of charlatanism or whatnot. But as any real scientific theory has to be falsifiable. Can both of you give me the 1 or 2 points that a rival researcher for the Savannah hypothesis or other hypotheses could find and say this is the nail in the coffin to the aquatic ape hypothesis? Erica, maybe you want to go first.
I thought the very poor vision we have underwater was that kind of nail, and I kind of wanted this theory to go away. I wanted to find some really counter argument, because I didn't understand why it wasn't like in the school books already. And I was hoping that underwater vision would be one of those arguments, but it turned out that we can train our underwater vision very well. So that was, for me, kind of that was also not a strong argument against water. But people do drown. But I hear that also marine mammals have to learn how to swim. So human drowning is an argument maybe against a universal aquatic adaptation. But most people, they don't learn how to swim when they can swim. It might be just a problem occurring later when we don't have contact with water.
But also, too, we know of groups like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans that may not have gone through a water phase that, say, Homo sapiens has. So I don't know if that would be really a bullet anyway.
Of course, it depends when you put the semi-aquatic or a beach ape period. To me, it's quite logical that it was very early, and that means that all the bipeds were involved then, and then it could have been going back and forth, like the Pinnacle Point group and so on. We would have, since way back when splitting from the other apes, this resource with all these different species of hominids that could turn to water when it was harsh on land, and they could go between the two environments. I don't see it as a kind of a single, quite modern period. I think it's quite logical that it happened quite early on.
Okay. Tom, what would you say would be a nail in the coffin for someone who wanted to falsify the hypothesis?
I think with these kinds of hypotheses where you can't repeat the experiment, that is, we can't repeat the evolution of humans, that it's a little bit different sort of story as whether there is a nail in the coffin. The Vernix hypothesis, the Vernix-Cassioto hypothesis that I referred to earlier, was first brought up by marine biologists, and got me interested in it when one marine biologist said it to Sir David Attenborough, and then we just went off and managed to test the hypothesis. I don't know that would have falsified it, but it certainly was something that many people considered to be confirmatory. These sorts of things, again, I mean, the history of plate tectonics, 50 years of being laughed at until it turned out to be right, and I don't know what would have actually falsified it, but they tended to be confirmed by very strong data of various sorts. So I think that's the way that'll be the course of this story as we move into even yet the next era.
Let me just give you both a minute or two to just sum up any ideas and what you may be working on in the future. So Erica, if you would, if you have any final thoughts, something I may have missed, and if you're working on any books or anything else, if you want to just let us know.
Right now, I'm working on the project, one of the many projects we have in our group, on why people actually drown. And I find it very interesting to turn around and see what are the problems with people in water, because I have been focusing on why we do so well in water, and I want now to turn around and see what are still the problems with people in water, because we are terrestrial after all. And I think we will learn a lot from studying. How can I say that? We are studying still all the aspects of free divers, and they are going deeper and deeper. But also you need some training for doing that, and we are focusing on that a lot in one line, and also on why some people don't succeed so well underwater. So I'm still looking for problems with the hypothesis, and we will see what we find. And also another thing, I think it's quite important in this discussion to say that the beach ape hypothesis doesn't exclude any evolution on land and on the savanna or in the forest. It's just one of the
a phase.
One of the important places where our ancestors have probably evolved. There are many bottlenecks. One of the bottlenecks was probably connected to water, and I don't think the anthropologists see it as either or, and I don't see that it cannot be combined with that are out there for the land part.
That's a good point. Let me just ask before I go to and give Tom his summing up. I just want a thought occurred to me. I know studies have been done on people in the Andes and in the Himalayas, the Sherpas and whatnot, and they have adapted to having more red blood cells, I believe, because of the high altitude. Do any of these groups that dive regularly and have for generations, do they have any adaptations or higher blood cell counts that they can hold more oxygen?
They have. And also when you train diving, you get much more red blood cells. We have shown that. Okay. And also these water people, they have several adaptations that are resembling also high altitude adaptations. Okay. We have seen that they have a large spleen, they have larger lungs than other populations, they have a stronger diving response. And to me, it would be very logical if people having evolved as quite good free divers, could acquire capacities to spread over the inland, even to high altitude, because the adaptations are very much the same.
Okay. Tom, let me give you a final say if I've missed anything, and then also anything else you want to say about your future research.
Well, the work that we've been pursuing lately that impinges upon the story is related to the microbiota and the development of microbiota in young animals and in children, and how the gut microbiota is affected by some of these fats that are found in Vernix gaseosa, which is found in the gut of uniquely at this point of humans and marine mammals. I am continue to be intrigued by this entire story and in various ways, both in things that are really part of my nutrition profession, trying to understand whether we really not whether, but I think we do require omega-3 fatty acids of certain types in our diets, and then also the intriguing work that I see in the work of folks like Erica and others who are studying human groups and how they function. So this has really been something that's both a professional and a personal interest, and will continue to be.
Well, I will link to both of your pages, Mid-Sweden University and Cornell University, and people who see this can contact you there. I want to thank you both for your time, and especially Tom sitting in an airport. So thank you, and good luck in the future.